Alright everybody, so the Thermaltake ToughAir 710. Thermaltake's supposedly high-end air cooler, and even before this thing launched, I had a little bit of a rocky history with it. So when we were at CES this year, I said this about it. This is supposed to be one of the best coolers around. So the expectations were set, and they were pretty high, but then fast forward to a couple of weeks ago at Computex, and I said this.
If I had any feedback for Thermaltake, is like you're building a $100 cooler, but you're spending 0.25 cents on a bit of plastic. Don't do it.
And let's just put it this way. I was ultra disappointed and pretty pissed off at the mounting system that Thermaltake used for their high-end heatsink. But now, after all of the tests were done, we've gone through so many hours of testing on this cooler, I'm actually happy to say it's better than I initially thought it would be. There is though one more thing that has contributed maybe a little bit to my more positive take on this cooler, and that's the fact that Thermaltake, instead of having this retail for the predicted $110 US, has, I guess, analyzed the market a little bit more, seen the competition and what they're doing, and has decided to release it for $85. That's actually a pretty big deal when you consider what else is actually out there. But you know what else is a good price? This case from Antec.
Antec is back, baby, with the impressive Performance One full tower capable of extreme cooling right out of the box. Delivered by this aggressive, but more importantly, airflow-friendly front panel with three 140mm fans and a 120 at the back for competitive placement in my temperature stack. Enjoy this discrete temperature monitoring for your hardware and a fully open interior for air cooling or water cooling components. The new Performance One FD by Antec. It seems the legends are back. Check it out below.
So let's start with my main problem with the ToughAir 710, and that hasn't changed whatsoever. It's the mounting system. And to explain this a little bit more, Robert, you're gonna have to come in here and we're gonna take a closer look at this thing. Okay, so what I have in front of me here is an Intel motherboard, because I have to preface all of this by saying that Thermaltake's installation kit for AMD is perfectly okay. My criticism only has to do with the Intel side. So let's start with the backplate. So first of all, Thermaltake is providing a plastic backplate along with these little studs. Now they're pre-installed here because I already installed them, but these studs tend to slip out and they are not very well press fit in this whole thing. Now the next step of the process here is to secure these retention arms to the studs that come up. Now this is where the problem starts. So what Thermaltake gives you are these little guys. I mean, these are what I've been so critical of in the past, and this is only for Intel systems once again. So instead of it having, like for example, I've got a deep cool mounting kit here, instead of it having a Phillips head, what it has is absolutely nothing, because this is a cheap piece of plastic that has a brass threaded area in here. So I mean you could call these like thumb nuts or something like that. So typically you're okay installing these things on every single end. Why? Because you have clear access and you can thumb or basically finger tighten them. That's totally okay. The problem is that so many high-end motherboards these days have larger and larger heat sinks that have been built up around the CPU socket area, and they're starting to encroach further and further into this area too. So these 3 points are completely okay. This one's a little bit tough to get to. The problem is this guy here in the corner. In order to properly get this on, you sort of have to fish it through, hope nothing moves, and then single finger tighten it right here, and finally hope that you have enough leverage, which typically you don't, in this small corner to get it tightened the rest of the way down. What you're going to need to do in some cases is just use a pair of needle nose pliers and tighten it the rest of the way. Otherwise, this is like a completely okay mounting system. All Thermaltake needed to do is exactly what Deepcool and pretty much everybody else in the high-end cooler industry does. Just give us a piece of metal instead of cheaping out on these things and put a Phillips head in here. I mean, come on. And I guess the biggest question about all of that bargain basement mounting kit is whether or not it actually has an impact on temperatures. So what you're seeing here are the average temperatures of 4 separate mounts for 2 different situations. One that's finger tightened to the max, while the other was further tightened with pliers. And yeah, there really isn't that much of a difference between the two, but the finger tightened method did consistently show ever so slightly higher temperatures in our logs. Either way, this whole plastic mounting system affair, and look, I know it sounds like I'm going on and on about it, but it's very, very important here because the ToughAir 710 actually has everything that it needs to be a high-end air cooler that will compete against pretty much anything else in its class. There's a nickel-plated copper base and 7 heat pipes that make their way upwards into 2 separate fin stacks, which are then finished with plain black and gray caps. Cooling is done by a pair of 140mm fans that use liquid crystal polymer fin blades, have hydraulic bearings, and run at up to 1,400 RPM or 1,100 RPM with the included low noise adapter. Obviously, the 710 isn't going to win any beauty contests. It just sticks to a simple formula of performance over aesthetics, but there is an all-black version coming that'll set you back a few bucks more. And look, being a top-tier air cooler does come with some sacrifices. I mean, this thing is big, tall, wide, and pretty heavy, but most of all, in its default fan config, there's only 25mm of memory height clearance. If you got higher modules, the front fan can be moved, of course, upwards. Just make sure you have enough case height for that. But if you compare it to something like the D15, it's actually a bit more compact overall. But does that slightly more compact size lead to less performance than Noctua's almost decade-old masterpiece? Well, there's one thing for sure. The ToughAir 710 is actually one of the quietest high-end coolers we've ever tested. So yeah, this thing is pretty quiet if you need it to be, but does the fact that it has some pretty good fans on here and its raw size actually lead to amazing temperatures? Well, we're going to start off with the gaming test to find that out. So let's start things off by popping in all the other coolers we've already covered. And I should also add, gaming doesn't put all that much of a load on today's CPUs, but it does heat up the system a fair amount. And this is a situation that seems to benefit the ToughAir 710 quite a bit, since it puts up some very, very good numbers right across every single decibel point. It even comes close to matching the D15 at 40 decibels, but ultimately it still loses to the Noctua, Frost Spirit, and Assassin 3, while the Peerless Assassin gets better numbers at low noise levels. Then again, if you want to run it a bit louder, the 710 is actually one of the best coolers I've ever tested. Its only challenge here is with breaking into the top 4 at a constant 38 decibels. It's certainly good, but still a solid 1.5 to 4 degrees behind the best coolers here. But guess what? That differential doesn't lead to any better or worse performance than the temperatures would lead you to believe, since most of the heatsinks fall right within this test's margin of error. That's why you end up seeing many of the hottest running coolers at the top of this chart. Moving on to full load testing and adding all of our previously tested coolers shows the current landscape. The ToughAir lands right here, and that actually makes it one of the best coolers we've ever tested, and it manages to beat some competitors that cost a whole lot more across the entire decibel range. And yet when you compare it to the top tier products, there's still a 2 to 4 degree delta at identical noise levels. You can really see how things shake out when all the heatsinks are normalized to 38 decibels again. The 710 is in the upper end of cooling performance, but there are certainly better heatsinks out there. And yet, when we're talking about raw clock speeds, Thermaltake's cooler is arguably just as good as the D15 and Assassin 3, since it can reach pretty much identical frequencies. But you have to remember, we're talking about only a 180 watt thermal load here, something that's manageable by much less expensive coolers. So on the flip side of that coin, at 38 decibels, there's literally a solid line in the clock speeds, so low temperatures really don't make all that much of a difference since the Intel CPU is already running at peak speed here. Now let's move on to 253 watts, and I just want to point something out here. The fact of the matter is that almost a decade, yes 10 years after it was released, companies are still trying and in most cases failing to beat the D15. Now you have to remember the D15 goes for $110 to $120 these days, which means the ToughAir 710's $85 price point makes it, I guess, an interesting option. But we also have to remember the Peerless Assassin and the Frostbeard both cost a lot less, while the Assassin 3 has hit $85 every now and then too, because it's going to be discontinued very soon. And that fact really hits home when you look at this. It isn't that Thermaltake is doing anyone a favor by pricing this at $85. They actually needed to, since there are so many alternatives that cost less but perform better. When we move over to the frequency chart and plot where the ToughAir lands, it starts in the middle of the pack but then steps things up at higher noise levels, to the point where at 42 decibels and above, it's actually one of the best here. The question though is whether or not you'll even want it running that loud. I also need to put this into a little bit of context, since the last chart might make the gaps between the best and worst coolers look absolutely massive. But when leveled out at 38 decibels, the delta is actually just 165 megahertz, with the 710 landing somewhere right in the middle, or about 42 megahertz behind the Frostbeard. Running the 13900K without limits pretty much destroys every single cooler out there, from a temperature perspective at least. But drilling down into clock speeds, it shows a very different story. It shows how some coolers are able to handle these heat loads a lot better than others. And Thermaltake's performance is, I guess, sorta all over the place. It's relatively good at low noise and then falls off in the mid end before picking up again above 41 decibels. That makes it better than the U12A and AK620, but behind less expensive options like the Peerless Assassin, Frost Commander, Frost Spirit, and even the HX7280. That places the ToughAir 710 solidly in the upper middle of the pack. And remember, this is when compared against the best of the best air coolers around. So make no mistake about it, this is a pretty good accomplishment for Thermaltake. Okay, let's just say like a hypothetical is going on and you can't find the Assassin 3 because it's, I don't know, out of stock, and the D15 is completely over budget for what you're doing, and maybe you can't find the Peerless Assassin or Frost Spirit, or they're like hideously expensive. Would I still recommend the ToughAir 710? And the answer to that is no. So I'm looking at you, Thermaltake. This is one of those things where your entire routine was absolutely amazing, but you just failed to stick the landing. Re-release this thing with a proper full metal mounting kit, including the back plate, and make sure that we're able to screw down the retention bracket, and you're probably going to have one of the most highly recommended coolers around right now, especially when a lot of high-end coolers are starting to be discontinued. So anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope you enjoyed this content. Thermaltake, I hope you're going to watch this, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.